Well, we welcome you to another one of our sessions going through the Apocalypse of John. This is episode number 4. Last time together we began our discussion of chapter 3, not of the Apocalypse, but chapter 3 in our notes on the beginning of emperor worship. And so we got about halfway through that. So we want to today in this episode begin to complete then this concept of worshiping the emperor and how it made its way from its birth thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia and began to make its way westward, especially then through Alexander the Great, which is where we left off last week. We're delighted that you are joining us on this journey as we lay the foundation in these early chapters of creating the historical context that helps us understand what the apocalypse is, how it functioned, and what the dynamics are in that culture at that time that are all coming into play then in the reading of the apocalypse. We're delighted that since our last session, we've had Sharon from Citrus Springs, Florida, contact us. We've had Benjamin from Arcade, New York. Richard, all the way from Glasgow, Scotland. Lynette has contacted us on the YouTube part of the internet, as has John C. on the internet as well. We've had Ted from Soxy, Texas, another internet from In Real Life, and then we've had Imnet, who's from Ethiopia, now living in Bellevue, Washington, Gail from Willis, Texas, Panyi Otis and his wife Inya in the area, just in the greater Sparta area in Greece, has contacted us. Michelle in Exshaw, Alberta, Canada, has joined us. Bert in St. Augustine, Florida, Lindell in Springdale, Arkansas, and Amanda in Tucson, Arizona. So we say welcome to each one of them. Welcome to the class. And if this is your first time to join us, we have a rough draft manual that we will send to you free of charge as a PDF. If you will send us an email that gives us your name and the city and state, or the city and country from which you are watching the seminars, we'll be happy to send you a PDF file that'll help you follow along. It has the footnotes and the citations, the bibliography that we're using for the comments that we're making. Now, at some point in the future, we will finish this session. We'll be no longer doing it live. It will remain, of course, on the internet, on YouTube, and on the church website. And once we go no longer live, but simply remaining as a video, the PDF file will no longer be available. And God willing, it shall then exist as its own book and be available directly from Amazon.com. But in the meantime, while we're making our journey together, please let us know and we'll send you the free PDF file so you can follow along with us. And as always, we're so grateful for Richard Yeager and Charlie Ward. Richard for coming each time and videoing this, trying to figure out the technology to also live stream it, which is a new feature that we're adding in these classes since we're filming them and taping them during the COVID pandemic, and we're unable to have people in the class with us. I want you to know that I miss your being here face to face. It's exciting when I can see you and when I can see your responses, whether it's something clicked and the lights went off, or whether it's shaking your head and going, what? there's interaction that takes place visually. But I'm grateful that you've let us know, maybe 48 people so far on the internet have asked for the PDF file. We had here locally 50 sets printed up that we have given out to families and couples and individuals. So we're delighted to know you're part of this. And so we pick up now in our episode 4, the second half of chapter 3, dealing with emperor worship. And so we begin then with divine kingship, the Seleucids, and Greek emperors. Alexander the Great, we followed and dealt with him last time, you remember. We began in Mesopotamia with Namram-Sin, and when we finished with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of 33. He died childless, leaving no heir to his throne. When asked to whom he was leaving the kingdom, he said, "To the strongest," even suggesting his funeral would inaugurate a great contest among his foremost generals to see who would succeed him. His generals, now known as successors, divided Alexander's empire and then fought each other for it. Alexander's dream of a new hybrid world died with him. Lacking a biological claim to the throne, his generals could only appeal to a likeness of identity, a likeness to Alexander's template that we dealt with last time of military conquest, joined together with his claim of divinity. Whether having Zeus or Apollo or Hercules as one's father, or by being self-proclaimed, deified yourself. It was Alexander's general Seleucus, of all the successors, who was best aware of the major theological shift created by the life and death of Alexander. Seleucus began his successful conquest for the empire in 312 BC. Going into his first major battle, Seleucus' army knew they were outnumbered. When Seleucus saw how frightened they were, he encouraged them by reminding them he had fought with Alexander and had been promoted not only by his combat ability, but on his cunning and ability to rise to his full potential in that moment. He further challenged his army, challenged them that the oracle speaking for God had called him King Seleucus and had promised him his desired victory. So he told his army, "I fought with Alexander and I was promoted up the ranks because I knew how to seize the moment." And secondly, he reminded them that an oracle for one of the gods had already declared him a king and had promised him the victory. He further told them Alexander had appeared to him in a dream and given him an unambiguous, unmistakable sign of the supremacy that lay in his own future, which would be achieved in the fullness of time. Seleucus achieved victory after victory and eventually claimed all of Mesopotamia, Turkey, and Syria. In addition to following Alexander's template with his military victories, he also followed Alexander's template with claims of divinity, being the son of Apollo. A famous inscription declared, "Seleucus is the child of Apollo, begotten by the god." Seleucus' son, Antiochus I, perpetuated their divinity in inscription to Apollo, the originator of our family. As Alexander had done, Seleucus also founded a city, and he named it Antiochus, after the name of his father Antiochus. We know it, of course, out of the New Testament as the city of Antioch, and dedicated the neighboring land there near Antioch to Apollo. Greek history had never known a son of God before Alexander. To be sure, Seleucus was not the only successor who received divine worship. However, Seleucus was the first and only son of God. Now, Alexander technically was a Macedonian and not a Greek, and Macedonian, but Alexander had set the precedent for a historical divine sonship, and Seleucus was swift to follow. This is something no other successor, one of the generals, had done. An appeal to the memory of Alexander, and thus the need to keep alive the memory of Alexander, was useful and convenient. The real claim to being an authentic emperor and a claimant to Alexander's empire lay not in carrying out Alexander's political vision of a harmonious hybridization of East and West that he had looked for. The real claim lay in claiming to be a god as Alexander had done. Alexander had blazed the path to divinity, and Seleucus demonstrated that others also could follow. And so they did. Apotheos, the assumption of divinity, of divine status by humans, was one of the salient features of kingship in the Hellenistic and the Greek age. Seleucus' empire lasted 242 years, from 305 to 63 BC, with 23 descendants sitting on the throne. Seleucus' grandson openly called himself Taos, God. In the 2nd century BC, Antiochus IV, Alexander Ballas, and Antiochus III, it should have said, Alexander Ballas and Antiochus IV, all call themselves Epiphanes, which means God manifest, God visibly to you. During his reign, Antiochus III, known as Antiochus the Great, who ruled from 223 to 187, regained control of the cities of Western Asia Minor, that would be Turkey, mainly Greek cities, near or along the coast of the Aegean and northern Mediterranean seas. Among these cities that are part of Antiochus Third Empire are the 7 churches of Asia to which John writes the Apocalypse. So now we are particularly dealing with the cultural identity preceding the birth of Christ and the writing of the book of Apocalypse by John. The liberation of the city Ephesus resulted in an altar being built by Antiochus III in that city. Within 1 or 2 years in the city of Ephesus, regular sacrifices of the new magistrates were transformed into sacrifices on the altar of the king to the king and his ancestors. In other words, Antiochus had paid for an altar to be built in a city so they could worship whatever god they were worshiping. But within 2 years, the people in that city on the altar of the king no longer were worshiping another god. They began worshiping the king himself who had built the altar. The second aspect of this new cult, now let me remind us, cult is a technical term. It's not some off-the-wall thing like we use it today in our vernacular. It's not Jim Jones giving us all a cup of Kool-Aid to drink in a mass suicide. Cult is a religious set of rituals and practice giving worship to a deity. So the second aspect of this new, I guess we would probably say today religion, but it's not identifiable that way because it wasn't so much a religion of the king. It was the new religion was worshiping all emperors, whoever they might be. So the individual worship of a particular ruler we call a cult. It is a new religion dedicated to that person, or a religious practice at a religious altar that is reserved to the worship of that one only. A second aspect of the new cult concerned Laodicea, the wife of Antiochus III. Just the same as a king could take the name of a former king, the wife of Antiochus III took the wife of a former ruler, and so she is Laodicea III. This Laodicea III, who had been responsible for providing dowries for the daughters of poor citizens. In the culture that a girl had to bring money with her to enter into a marriage, and the poor could not afford it, here the queen made money available as dowries. In gratitude, a new cult, a new religious practice was founded. There was to be an unmarried priestess of Aphrodite Laodiceas, that is, the queen had now been hybrid, collated with the goddess of love, Aphrodite. A procession on the queen's birthday and sacrifices by all the brides and bridegrooms were made to the queen. These cults, the one offering worship to the king, and now the one offering worship to the queen, established the king and queen as the center of the civic life of this city. both politically and socially and religiously. They were the city that celebrated the worship of the king and the queen. A second example is the city of Taos, which Antiochus Iii declared to be sacred, inviolable, and free of tribute. This city was set aside, didn't have to pay taxes, where a cult of Antiochus in Laodicea was established in 204, 203 BC, with a separate altar now for each. The citizens of the town participated in the cultic worship ceremonies under the supervision of the priest of the king. Magistrates, officials of the city, recorded the names of the citizens who participated in the holy book, probably the civic cultic calendar. Cult statues of the king and queen were dedicated in this temple beside the cult statue of Dionysius, the chief god of the city. And it was in his temple that they brought the other two altars, so that you celebrated the cult of Dionysius, you could celebrate the cult of Antiochus III, and celebrate the cult of his wife Laodicea III. According to the inscription on the altars, Antiochus III and Laodicea III should receive honors from everyone to the greatest possible extent, and by sharing in the temple and other matters with Dionysius, they should become, these two, Antiochus and Laodicea, will become the common saviors of our city and should give us benefits in common to all of us in the city. Now I've got to note, terms such as Theos, God, and Soter, Savior, were titles reserved exclusively for the Greek gods until the end of the Peloponnesian Wars inside Greece in 405 BC, after which these divine titles began to be given to living humans by a city-state, to human heroes for having saved or rescued their city. So the label, the epitaph, Theos and Soter, God and Savior, that was originally reserved for gods and heroes, always now indicate a cult for the person who receives this title upon them. At first, these titles were used in a localized sense, as the one that saved a particular city. Maybe it was under attack and you came with your army and rescued them, liberated them. And so it was the city that had been liberated that now established an altar for worshiping as their God and Savior, the liberator who has rescued the city. Therefore, the one being worshiped in a cult was being worshiped locally in that city, in that location, and not universally across all of Turkey or across the Seleucid Empire, but locally they were honored. However, beginning with Alexander the Great, After his conquest of Persia that we dealt with last week, and especially during his Afghanistan campaign, the idea of an imperial cult began to merge, an empire-wide systematic worship of the emperor. After Alexander's death, the divine worship of the reigning king and his predecessors, established by the king himself, obligatory for an entire territory of the empire and uniform in its cultic practice, was given birth by the Seleucids, whose empire eventually covered the western end of Turkey, including all the cities of the 7 churches of Asia named in the Apocalypse. In other words, the idea of an imperial cult wasn't initiated by the city that was saved. It's now being imposed by the emperor on the whole empire, so that everyone in the empire would now worship and have the same practice of worship of the living emperor. End of our note on that topic. Now, in addition to offering sacrifices on the respective altars, an offering of first fruits of the trees was to be made each year to the cult statue of the king, and that the priest was to ensure that the statue be crowned with the produce of the seasons. So you've got in the temple of Dionysios, you're going to have a statue of Dionysios. You now are going to have a statue of the emperor. And just like you are going to put a garland of grapes at the grape harvesting time on the head of the statue of Dionysius, you will likewise place a garland of grapes on the head of Antiochus. You're honoring both as identical gods. Placing a fruit garland as a crown on Antiochus, his statue indicated the equality of divinity with Dionysius, who was often depicted wearing a crown of grapes. We have the illustration there in your manual, and it will be embedded on the taped copy that will be made available later on YouTube. Therefore, in the list of Seleucid kings, a special place on that list is reserved for Antiochus III, known as the Great, because he instituted in his entire kingdom this innovative, all-inclusive ruler cult, with the intent of supplying its varied and far-flung provinces with a cultic common denominator. You see, his empire was from Persia through Mesopotamia, through Turkey, Syria. All of that was different ethnicities, different religion practices, and Antiochus III was the first in the West to now impose a common emperor worship on the entire empire that Alexander had died before he could achieve. The unifying glue across a multicultural empire, the common denominator, the unifying principle, was the common act of worshiping the emperor as divine. It was Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, known as God Manifest, who insisted upon including Eretz Israeli Jews in this practice. The Jews had been exempt until Antiochus IV Epiphanes and his efforts to impose imperial worship on the Jews brought about the famous outbreak of rebellion and civil war in Judea, led by Judas the Hammer, Judas Maccabeus, and it's told in the 3 books of Maccabees in our Old Testament. So we're no longer just dealing with ancient history. We're now coming into the present, dealing with something 150 to 200 years before Christ, and the story is told in 3 Book of Maccabees, 1, 2, and 3 in our Orthodox Old Testament. The Seleucid Empire lasted from 312 until Roman General Pompey turned what was left of the empire into a Roman province in 63 BC. The Seleucid legacy of emperor cults and emperor worship survived in the West as Rome transitioned from a republic into an empire. The legacy of opposition to emperor worship survived in Judea, which eventually became a client nation with a form of autonomous rule under local kings in the Roman Empire. Well, the Seleucids, the Greeks, were now up to and including Syria, Turkey, Palestine, Judea, and the Romans have come. So let us now look at the Romans and the adoption by the Romans of worshiping the emperor. As Rome moved eastward, out of the Mediterranean eastward, into the Seleucid Empire, even as Alexander had experienced centuries before, conquering Roman generals were welcomed and treated as gods in Turkey, Mesopotamia, and so forth. Worshipping a human as a god was a foreign practice to the citizens of Rome in Italy. This had to do with the fact that Rome was a republic. The people chose the senators who then passed the laws they lived by. A ruler cult, worshiping an emperor, presupposes the existence of a ruler, a king, an emperor, or some other leader figure, and the Roman Republic, in the very nature of the term, had no ruler. Now, this is not to say that the phenomenon was at any time unknown in the Republican era of the Roman Empire. It merely reflects that the Roman Republic, which finally collapsed with Julius Caesar, was never ruled by a human individual with power perceived as absolute and permanent, not until Julius Caesar. Therefore, as the first emperor of Rome, actually the creator of the empire, the first Roman to become a god was Julius Caesar. He will be declared a god after his death by the Roman Senate. So the Imperial Cult, the worship of the Roman emperor, began with Julius Caesar. It is impossible to overstate the consequences of Caesar replacing the Republic with an empire. One could ask, and rightly so, where did the audacity to do such a thing come from? From where did it come? It is not our purpose to explore the life and mind of Julius Caesar any more than it was to do so with Alexander the Great. Others have done this, and in greater depth and detail than we can summarize it for our purposes. For example, Stefan Weinstock, using many primary sources, covers in detail Caesar's journey from being born a man to being proclaimed a god by the Roman Senate upon his death. What a journey! We'll not even attempt to summarize the 469 pages of that book. I know. Whew. Nor is there time to discuss the history of the development of the imperial cult in the various cities across Asia Minor and Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean world, much less discuss the movement of the Roman imperial cult westward across North Africa to Spain, into France, Britain, northward as far north as Cologne, Germany. Duncan Fishwick devoted 275 pages to discussing the history of the Roman imperial cult in the western end of the Roman Empire. But what is of interest to us is the relationship between Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Three ancient historians speak of an event that occurred in Cadiz, Spain in 69 BC, when Caesar was 31 years old. Plutarch, writing around 75 AD, about 144 years later, in like manner, this is what he said, in like manner, we are told again that in Spain, when Julius Caesar, was at leisure and was reading from the history of Alexander, he was lost in thought for a long time, and then he burst into tears. His friends were astonished and asked the reason for his tears. "Do you not think," said Caesar, "it is a matter for sorrow that while Alexander, at my age, was already a king of so many peoples, I have achieved no brilliant success. Suetonius, writing around 100 AD, 25 years after Plutarch, described the event this way. As questor, he was appointed to further Spain, that's a region, where, while conducting a round of assizes at the instigation of the praetor, he reached Cadiz and saw there the statue of Alexander the Great in the temple of Hercules. He sighed deeply and, as if frustrated by his own lack of achievement in failing to perform anything worthy of note at an age when Alexander had already subjugated the world, he immediately sought his discharge from that government position so he could seize the first opening for a greater position back in Rome. Moreover, on the following night, shocked by a dream of raping his mother, he was nevertheless encouraged by the soothsayers, whose interpretation of that dream filled him with the highest hopes, that the mother he had conquered was no other than the earth herself, who is deemed to be our universal parent. We call her Mother Nature today. And the last of these three ancient authors, Dio Cassius, writing around 180 AD, or almost 2.5 centuries after Julius Caesar. This lets us know, does it not? We are keeping alive the memory of Alexander, and here we are 180 years plus after Julius Caesar. We're keeping alive his memory, Caesar, and we're keeping alive the connection between the two. Dio says, he, Caesar, was eager for glory, emulating Pompey and his other predecessors who at one time or another had had great power, and his aspirations were anything but small. In fact, he hoped, if he should at this time accomplish anything, to be chosen a consul immediately, this is after he was in Spain, and display mighty achievements. He was especially encouraged in this hope by the fact that while at Cadiz in Spain, he had dreamed of intercourse with his mother and had learned from the seers that he should enjoy great power. Hence, on beholding, there is a likeness of Alexander dedicated in the temple of Hercules. He groaned aloud, lamenting that he had performed no great deed as yet. However interesting this literary history may be, or boring, I should say, for some of us, what is of note and what is important in the weeks ahead is the association of Julius Caesar with Alexander the Great. Alexander's self-identity drive for greatness is associated with his visit to the oracle at Ammon in Egypt. In similar fashion, Caesar's self-identity and drive for greatness is associated with his encounter with Alexander's statue, as two of the authors say, or with reading the story of the other author. Alexander's life ended when he was 33. At about the same age Alexander died, Caesar had yet to start. And so where Alexander finished, Caesar began. The similarities achieved by the two great empire builders are striking. Alexander conquered the hereditary enemy, the Persians. Caesar likewise conquered the hereditary enemy of Rome, Gaul. The campaigns in both instances were a matter of national revenge. Alexander had been the first Greek leader to cross the Danube. Caesar matched this by crossing the Rhine. A similar polarity may be seen in the fact that Alexander had gone to the extreme southeast in India, while Caesar had gone to the extreme northwest in Britain. They had gone as far as they could go, as it were. The similarities between Alexander and Caesar do not end there. Moreover, Caesar was the first Roman, as Alexander had been the first Greek, to envision a community of imperial dimensions based upon a citizenship far wider than that of any city-state. By conquering Gaul, Caesar turned the face of the Greco-Roman civilization toward continental Western Europe and the future. Here, his accomplishment was perhaps greater than that of Alexander, for it was toward the past and not the future that civilization turned when it went east to conquer Mesopotamia. It became the future of the planet when Caesar went west and conquered Gaul, when Columbus from the west sails west to get east and discovers a brand new world. Under the powerful, suggestive influences of Alexander at the shrine of Hercules in Cadiz, the environment that symbolized for the Roman mind the tradition of world conquest and great achievement, Caesar suddenly recognized his own future. It was a future to be achieved by using Alexander's template, military conquest, and self-deification. Alexander and Caesar both created an empire. Both died having done so and without surviving the birth of the empire they created. For both, others would make use of the template they created, the others would inherit. A template that included creating an imperial cult with temples, statues, and rituals, and the deification of emperors. Well, what then about this divine kingship among the emperors themselves after Julius Caesar. Time permits only the briefest summary of the development of the Imperial Cult after Caesar. Caesar died from assassination on March 15, 44 BC. Having no heir in his will, Caesar had named his great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, as his heir. Octavius was the grandson of Caesar's sister and Caesar's oldest living male relative. Like the conflict of power between Alexander's generals following his death, the 17 years following Caesar's death were a time of civil war and strife. Finally, Octavius defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC. He consolidated his power, and 4 years later, in 27 BC, declared Caesar Augustus by the Roman Senate. Also, like Alexander's empire, being left to his generals to create, likewise Caesar's empire was created by Caesar Augustus, the first ruling emperor of the Roman Empire. The empire that Augustus created included establishing the worship of the emperor in the Imperial Cult. The defining moment in the development of a provincial ruler cult arrived in the winter of 3029 BC, when embassies from the people of Asia and Bithynia, from western and northwestern Turkey, approached Octavian with an offer of honors traditionally bestowed on a conqueror who had brought peace and deliverance. The worship of the emperor begins then in western Turkey, where the 7 cities of the Apocalypse are located. And the worship of the Roman emperor was initiated by the people themselves at the request of a non-Roman population. The language of the sources makes it clear that the initiative came from the provincials, from the provinces, to whom Octavian responded by formulating guidelines for accepting the provincial cult. The language of the sources makes it clear that the initiative came from the people of the provinces, to whom Octavian responded by formulating the rules, the guidelines for an acceptable province-wide cult. Resident Roman citizens were instructed to worship the goddess Roma, the goddess of Rome, and divine Julius Caesar, whereas non-Roman provincials might pay cult worship to the emperor himself, provided that the goddess Roma had her place in the worship. Caesar Augustus made it possible for a Roman living in Turkey to worship the goddess of Rome and Julius Caesar without directly worshiping him, Augustus, whereas all the non-Romans in the province would worship Rome and Augustus. In line with this ruling, sacred precincts, sacred areas, temple structures were to be built at Ephesus, where the Apostle John resided, one of the 7 cities, and Nicaea, for the goddess Roma, divine Julius, and at the city of Pergamum, again, one of the 7 cities, and Nicomedia, a temple for Roma and Octavian. In the East, Rome had to cope with the difficult challenge of the existing practice of Hellenistic ruler worship. While in the West, where before Augustus there existed no pre-Roman belief in the divinity of the ruler, and no trace at all of the cult of Roma, making Rome deified as a goddess, the cult of the Roman emperor would be developed, would be shaped as policy required. Augustus began the Roman Imperial Cult in the East in 3029 BC. The evolution of provincial ruler cult in the Latin West dates from the first decade or so of the reign of Augustus. By the end of Augustus' reign in 14 AD, a center for the worship of the emperor, quite possibly in combination with the goddess Roma, looks to have been established in northwest Spain, including what is today France, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germania, to the Elbe. So broadly throughout much of the Western Empire. So this is not something that will remain in the East, but will gradually be adopted by Rome and will be used all the way. I think even a imperial cult shrine or temple was built in England. As Alexander had begun, as the Greek Seleucids had implanted, likewise now Augustus followed the practice of using an imperial worship cult as the unifying commonality for an empire comprised of multiple cultures, ethnicities, languages, local customs, and identities. Regarding the distinction between Roman and non-Roman places of worship that were originally established there in Turkey, in practice, the distinction between Roman and non-Roman and the different forms of cult they originally allowed was non-existent in the West, just as assuredly as it evaporated sooner or later in the East. In fact, there is no trace of a similar arrangement. There's no trace of letting the Romans do it one way and everybody else a different way. There is no trace of that arrangement at any time, anywhere else in the empire, whether east or west, except initially at first, while Caesar Augustus had to make sure he had solidified his power and didn't have an insurrection from the folks back in Italy. In other words, there was never any real distinction between Romans worshiping the Roman emperor and non-Romans worshiping the emperor. The distinction, therefore, was never ethnic. In the beginning, there in Turkey, the distinction was this: one was allowed, the Romans could if they wished; the other was required. All the non-Romans must worship the emperor. Provincial cults in a province wide, were required for the whole province and eventually the whole empire. City cults, municipal cults, were cults established by an individual city for their own worship of an emperor that they liked or wanted to impress. Officially in the city of Rome, there may have been no official state worship of Augustus in his lifetime. However, this does not mean there was no divine worship of the living emperor taking place in Rome. It only means that he never received a state-built temple in Rome. Roman historians Dio and Suetonius give a history of Rome in terms of the official thinking and practice of the state as expressed in the capital of Rome and its senatorial class. It's the official transcript, if you will. These Roman historians limit their writing to the official practice of the government. Thus, the whole aspect or sphere of private cults, personal cults, is simply ignored by them. That is, they ignore the ample evidence of private divine cults, private worship of the emperor, temples, altars, sacrifices dedicated to the living emperor Augustus, both in Rome itself and in the rest of Italy. Caesar Augustus honored Julius Caesar as a divi, a god, divine, divinity, deity, and established an imperial cult to him. As the adopted son of Julius, Augustus identified himself as Divi Filius, son of God. Augustus issued coins with the image of Julius Caesar on one side, bearing the inscription Divios Julius Julius Caesar God, or Julius God. That was on one side of the coin, and on the back side was his own image, the image of Caesar Augustus with the inscription Caesar Divi. On the flip side, D-I-V-I-F, you can see it in the picture on the coin on the left. Caesar on one side on that coin of the face, The backside, D-I-V-I-F, is short for Son of God. So we now have declared by Rome, Julius Caesar is a god. Augustus has implemented and initiated the worship, the Imperial Cult, with temples of the Emperor of Rome. And as the adopted son of Julius Caesar, he now refers to himself as Son of God. And on the coins used in his reign, one side had the picture of Julius Caesar, Julius the God, and on the back side, Caesar the Son of God. You recall the story in the Synoptics when the disciples or the Pharisees were tempting Jesus with the question, should Jews pay taxes to Rome? And Jesus said, take out a coin. Whose face is on it? At the time of Jesus, thereafter, it was no longer Caesar Augustus, though his coins may have been in place. I believe it's going to be the son of Augustus, Tiberius. And it will be the picture and the inscription of Caesar that is on the coin. And Christ says, give unto Caesar what is his. Give unto God what is his. There you see the coin that may have been used in that story. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, every one to his own city. Joseph went from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in 4 BC during the reign of Caesar Augustus. The Caesar Augustus who called himself Son of God. Jesus was 17 years old when Caesar Augustus died. The events in the New Testament, as well as the writing of all the books within the New Testament, including the Apocalypse, all occurred within the first full century of the Roman Empire. Augustus, the birth of Christ. Tiberius, the crucifixion of Christ. Claudius, Jews expelled from Rome, Paul's missionary trips. Nero, Paul's epistles will have been written. Saints Peter and Paul will be martyred. The Gospel of Mark will be written. Emperor Titus, Matthew and Luke will be written, along with the rest of the New Testament. Domitian, the Gospel of John, and the Apocalypse will occur. We do not live our lives in a vacuum. We live within a particular historical context that gives us the mental and cultural tools by which we understand the events surrounding us, as well as make sense and meaning as we live our own lives. We, my immediate audience, live in the United States. The way we think and how we live our lives is shaped in part by George Washington, Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln, and the Civil War. For many of us, World War I and World War II, Korea and Vietnam have shaped our lives or the lives of our family. For others, America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan shaped their understanding of the world today. Presently, the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic imposes its will on us. It certainly has our personal and collective attention, whether only for the moment or the long term is yet to be seen. This dry, dusty history of Sargon the Great, Naram Sin, Alexander the Great, the Persian War, the Seleucid Empire, and now Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire, and Augustus, creating and using the worship of the emperor as the uniting commonality, was ever as much alive to the followers of Christ in their world in the first century as our memories of the last 200 years are for us. The followers of Christ in the first century did not live in an historical vacuum any more than we do. Our God is the living God. He is still speaking today as He spoke then. In our hurry to see what the apocalypse has to say to us, by ignoring the historical context in which God spoke through John in the apocalypse, we are in danger of not hearing what God is saying to us today because we're too busy trying to read our context back into the apocalypse rather than letting God speak to us and reveal Himself as He is within our lives, as He is today within our historical context. You see, there is a whole story, a whole cultural context, a backstory of how people thought and lived their lives that is invisible to us, but which is nevertheless present in the apocalypse. If we are to enter in and experience the apocalypse, we must first enter the cultural life of the first century. In 4 BC, the second person of the Trinity, the Word, became flesh and dwelt among us. He who is the Son was born when another claimed to be the Son of God. St. Paul understood. He declared he dared to beard the lion in its den when he identified himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ, who was declared the Son of God in power by the resurrection from the dead. It is in his letter to the Romans that he says it. In Romans, Paul is addressing the Roman Empire as a political entity. He is declaring that the Emperor of Rome is not the Son of God. For Caesar, the living Caesar, became a god when he died, while he who is the Son of God is declared God by being raised from the dead. One is declared God when he's buried and left buried. The other is declared by God himself when he raises himself from the dead. As early as Paul, who's going to be executed by the Roman Emperor Nero in 64 AD, all the way to 95, 93, the middle of the 90s, when John is writing the Apocalypse, and Domitian, the emperor now, not only the Son of God, but calling himself the Lord and Master, and having himself called God and Master, the battle lines are drawn. The battle lines between the Roman Emperor and Jesus Christ, over which one is the Son of God, the battle lines are drawn. The Roman Senate declared Herod the King of the Jews. The Roman Senate declared Julius Caesar a god after he died. The resurrection of Jesus Christ declares him, the living God, to be the Son of God. In case you haven't got it yet, the Apocalypse is about a battle between Rome and God. Well, we're not going to take a break today and have a second session. This ends our chapter 3, so we're going to stop there so we can start fresh next week with our brand new next chapter, chapter 4. And next week, we are now taking all of this background and moving closer into the foreground. You remember last week we reminded ourselves of Daniel and the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had about world history, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. We've actually spent 2 weeks now surveying the political world of Nebuchadnezzar's vision that Daniel gives us. In our next chapter, we're going to begin looking at the interconnection of Alexander the Great, Daniel, and the Jewish people. Wow. We are now getting closer, leaving Mesopotamia behind, and getting closer to the present, the birth of Christ, and the writing of the Apocalypse. So, I invite you to be with us in our next episode as we gather together. We pray for your safety. We pray for you and your family to be able to interact, be able to have contact with one another as safely as possible. And by God's grace and God's will, we'll see everyone again next week. Thank you.